You know, I thought I would be burnt out on Dark Souls by now, pun intended. After my interest in finishing Dark Souls 2 petered off, I was a bit worried I wouldn't have it in me to actually play through Dark Souls 3 to the end, including the DLC. But much to my surprise, Dark Souls 3 did grip me to the end. Now, much like the other entries, this isn't my first romp with Dark Souls 3. I've logged an ungodly amount of time into this. 333 hours to be exact at time of recording. Expect a lot of tonal whiplash with this critique as well, as I have a very strong love-hate relationship with this game. Despite how many hours I've put into it, this is probably the Soulsborne game I complain about the most. But I can't deny the overall quality is far above most of the other entries in the series, except for Bloodborne. Dark Souls 3 is more or less a swan song to the Souls series, the culmination of everything from Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Bloodborne, and a bit of a cliff note of Dark Souls 2. I guess Miyazaki wasn't too big on that entry either, since he didn't have his hand in it. For better or worse, this is the culmination of everything that makes the Soulsborne series the Soulsborne series. Much like the previous videos, I'm not going to dwell on this game's story. I was able to get more personal investment in the lore at launch since I was able to avoid community discussion, but much like Dark Souls 1, it was inevitably picked to death and killed my interest in diving deeper into it when the DLC came out. On the other hand, this may be a controversial opinion, but this game may have my favorite character cast of the entire Souls series overall. At least in terms of NPCs you can interact with. Henri, Siegward, Lapp, and probably the most underrated of them, Orbeck. If I had to make one complaint, and this was a problem I glazed over with Dark Souls 2 as well, it's that many of the NPCs go to Firelink Shrine and stay there for the entirety of the game. It makes the majority of the characters feel as though they lack agency, though in some instances that can indeed be a part of their character, such as the Firekeeper and Ludlith. There are many other characters to be sure, but these are the standout examples for me. The best characters are those that undergo an arc through their ongoing journey, like the likes of Henri, Siegward, and Lapp, but I'll leave it at that. Though I do feel like Siegward gets some unnecessary shit for allegedly being Siegmeyer again, but I think that undersells him. Siegward, unlike Siegmeyer, takes action. While Siegmeyer in Dark Souls 1 would spend most of his time planning, Siegmeyer is actively moving forward with his duty and helps you in combat on occasion, only needing assistance when he's hit an impossible obstacle. Not exactly sure how he got tricked into taking off his armor and hopping in a well, but still. I like Siegward a lot. One nice touch many seem to ignore is how you can track his path through the world even if you don't come across him directly. Most notably with his signature Estus Soup and Sunbro Covenant and Sun Talismans in the Undead Settlement and Faerun Keep respectively. And when you enter a fight against Jorm the Giant, whew, if that isn't one of the most standout moments in the entire Souls series, I don't know what is. That aside, most of my conflicted opinions lie in the gameplay, so before I dive waist deep into that, I'll touch on the visuals and music. It should come as no surprise that this Souls game exhibits some of the best art direction, graphical fidelity, and sound design in the series. Every environment, of which there are many, are more richly detailed than ever, only rivaled by Bloodborne. The only area in the entire game I feel is a tad lackluster visually is the Road of Sacrifices and Faerun Keep, which, while sporting some unique architecture, can come across as a tad samey thanks to the lack of level design, especially Faerun Keep. Those aside, the overall quality of the environments is so high that it's difficult to point to any one in particular, but if pressed, I guess I'd say that my favorite locations visually are the High Wall of Lothric, the Painted World of Ariandel, the Dreg Heap, and the Ringed City. Irithyll is beautiful as well, but the Painted World appeals to my tastes ever so slightly more. Music and sound design is spot on. Not much to say, really. I'd say it's about on par with Dark Souls 1 with high quality audio. Though I know audiophile, so take that as you will. The only track that really leapt out at me was the Abyss Watchers, which ramps up beautifully as you enter Phase 2. Other than that, I've not much else to say about the audio. On the level design front, I don't think it's a stretch to say that this game has the best level design in the entire series, sitting near the top with Bloodborne and Demon Souls. While at launch I was mildly disappointed that the world wasn't interwoven Metroidvania style like Dark Souls 1, the sheer quality of the level design throughout most of the game was absolutely sublime, with the only exception of course being the aforementioned Road of Sacrifices and Faerun Keep, which are largely flat swamps with little to no variation in the geometry. Most of the game's level design harkens back to the level design philosophy of Demon Souls more than anything. The game is largely linear in terms of progression and most branching paths leading into dead ends, but almost every level is intricately designed in such a way that they loop back in on themselves multiple times so that a single checkpoint, or bonfire as they're known, can be used for an entire level without negatively impacting the iteration time. The means by which the game opens shortcuts to old bonfires may vary, but the effect is largely the same, and it's brilliant across the board, with few exceptions. Bonfires are no closer to one another than they need to be. The only time bonfires usually end up close to one another in ways that don't really make sense is if they're a boss bonfire, which is to say, a bonfire that spawns in every boss arena after their defeat. I'd hardly consider it a flaw, but it's worth noting simply for how odd it is. Enemy placement is smart, with most shortcomings resulting from mechanics rather than the enemy placement itself. Unlike Dark Souls 2, enemies that appear in groups are typically weak mobs like Dark Souls 1, with very rare exceptions. As a result, it seldom feels unfair when the game decides to ramp the challenge with groups of stronger enemies. Now this is where my praise peters off a bit, as the gameplay itself is where things get iffy. Dark Souls 3's gameplay on its surface is very similar to Dark Souls 1. Many animations and hitboxes are similar, though hitboxes are a bit more on point. Controls are tight and responsive, much like the originals. So, prior to the game's launch, you'd be forgiven for thinking they'd be going back to the series' roots mechanically. And you'd be right. Sort of. The parts that it replicates from Dark Souls 1 are good. Very good. It refines the foundation of Dark Souls 1 into something a bit more memorable, and builds on that base in ways that some people like, and in ways that I personally don't. So let's get into that. Some of the biggest changes brought about in regards to the combat design in Dark Souls 3 are the removal of active poise in favor of hyper armor on attacks, carrying over strong attacks for Bloodborne, and the addition of weapon arts. Right. Let's start with the poise thing, as I feel like that impacts the overall design of the game more than anything else. If you recall from my Dark Souls 1 critique, I mentioned how the game has a consistency of rules, by which I mean, with the exception of bosses, the player and enemies operate by the same rules. Both possess poise and maintain a threshold at which that can be broken to stagger them. As I mentioned, Dark Souls 3 doesn't have active poise, which is fine. Most of my immediate issues with it lie in how the game masquerades as its predecessor's gameplay, but changes ever so slightly. Depending on your playstyle throughout the series, it may even go unnoticed. If your builds in the previous entries were more focused on evasion, for instance, and wearing light armor, you might not notice the lack of poise, as you likely didn't have much to begin with. But if you're like me and enjoy face-tanking shit with heavy armor and risking full force of attacks to trade damage, changing to a system in which you'll get staggered out of your attacks or movement regardless of armor or enemy is quite jarring. And that's the crux of it. Dark Souls 3 attempts to funnel the gameplay focus in such a way as to restrict playstyle available to you, unlike the previous entries. The lack of poise means dodging is mandatory in all circumstances for most players. Shields are more viable than they were in Dark Souls 2, to be sure, but they're more of a last resort to avoid damage than a fortified defensive measure, with the possible exception of great shields. Poise, compounded by a heavily nerfed early game magic system, means that most players are limited to evasive melee builds, regardless of their starting set. Bloodborne did this as well, but you're a hunter in that game. You're a hunter when you start, and a hunter when it ends, with differences largely being superficial. Bloodborne is its own series as well, so it's to be expected that it tries to distance itself from its sister series in some regards. The reason this is jarring for Dark Souls 3, I wager, is that the series has its roots in role-playing. Dark Souls 1, and heck, even Dark Souls 2, embrace this aspect by making multiple playstyles viable from the start, though this was admittedly handled better in Dark Souls 1 than in Dark Souls 2. One benefit that arose from this change in design philosophy is that enemies can be built with a particular playstyle in mind. Most enemies lack poise like the player, which unfortunately makes the enemies with poise stand out as frustrating. With the light weapons, this includes a wide variety of knight enemies, but with mid and heavy weapons, the most standout examples of the poise problem are the Cathedral Knights. These enemies sport the most poise in the entire game, and typically die before their poise is broken, meaning they can attack you unimpeded by your attacks, while they smash your fucking face in. The worst offender is the Greatsword variant, which I'd argue is literally the worst enemy in the entire game, which thankfully is only in a handful of locations and is only mandatory to confront on 1 or 2 occasions. The obvious issue is that these enemies have poise while you don't, breaking the established design philosophy of the first game that I mentioned earlier. And this isn't the only instance of this sort. Another way in which the game ignores established design philosophy of Dark Souls 1 that's poise-related is how both enemies and the player have the ability to arbitrarily ignore a combo 2 hits in, which will allow you to dodge or start your own combo, but thanks to most enemies having combos that go well beyond 2 hits, you're best off just evading. Not much in the way of options, eh? Yeah, attack animations still require some commitment, so attacking in this opening is guaranteed failure. So you might be thinking, that's fine. The same applies to the enemies, so, it should be good. And yes and no. For most enemies, you can reliably stunlock them, even during the arbitrary combo break, since most enemies don't evade. But Pontiff Knights, the fucking Pontiff Knights! These fuckers gave me a fuck ton of grief. Not only do they break out of your combos after 2 attacks, but they have a short enough wind-up on their own combos that they can start their combo in the middle of your combo during the briefest of openings. And their combos are not only fast, they're aggressive, long-reaching, and annoying as fuck. I've seen some of their combos go on for as long as 5 hits, and it's fucking obnoxious. If you can't tell by my fucking tone, I don't like them! Funneling design is fine. It could have worked. But as I've hopefully demonstrated with these examples of how poise is handled, that unless the enemy design is built properly around it, it can be ruinous to the experience. Fortunately, the game makes up for this enough in other ways. But unfortunately, it's also why I have such a strong love-hate relationship with this game. And why the majority of my runs use weapons with the skill Perseverance, which grants you temporary unlimited poise and defense bonuses, meaning you can have a taste of what the game would have been like had armor functioned like fucking armor. I'll buy it with the requirement that you use a particular set of weapons if you want to take advantage of the skill. The other changes to combat are relatively minor. Charged strong attacks are just stronger strong attacks, with longer delays before the attack is landed, as you might expect. In Bloodborne, this implementation of this feature was meant to make landing backstabs more difficult, but since backstabs function similar to Dark Souls 1 and 3, that purpose is lost, and it's just a neat thing to do if you have a big enough opening now. Weapon arts are the feature I was most looking forward to prior to launch, in all honesty. It's a nice idea to blend the concept of Bloodborne trick weapons into the more grounded weapons of the Souls series. In general, I think they're perfectly serviceable and add a nice bit of variety to the combat. If I had to complain about anything, it's the handful of weapons introduced in the DLC, and the Fair and Greatsword of the base game, which sport flourishing movesets that are difficult to read for PvP, and stand in direct contrast to the otherwise grounded combat of Dark Souls 3. Now, I do have a gripe with boss fights. For the most part, they're great. In fact, I'd go as far as to say they're all great fights in terms of design, moveset, etc. The main issue is similar to what I mentioned with the likes of Artorias Manus and Fume Knight, in that some of the bosses are just too aggressive for their own good. Fights like Pontiff Sullivan, Nameless King make it very difficult to reliably heal during the fight, since their openings are so tight that you're most likely to get comboed to death before you end your healing process than you are to recover. This overly demanding design philosophy takes away from some otherwise great fights. Another issue, and this largely applies to the Ring City DLC, the second DLC for those of you not in the know, is the bosses have far too much HP. Souls combat is not fitted for battles of attrition, especially when said battles of attrition feature bosses that can obliterate you in a handful of hits, or hound your ass with few instances to get breathing room. As a result, I tend to call in assistance for the Ring City boss fights. If I had to praise the DLC for anything, it'd be that it has a much better understanding of what enemy design is best suited to the gameplay in Dark Souls 3 than the base game had, leading to far more enjoyable combat encounters. They even made dogs bearable to fight. Okay, they're wolves, but still, same family. And dogs that don't get on my tits in a Souls game is quite the achievement indeed. I don't know what Miyazaki has against dogs, but every entry, including Bloodborne, has made them worse as the series goes on. I'd go as far as to say the dogs in Dark Souls 3 are fucking broken. I swear those little fuckers teleport and glitch around areas just to get a hit in. I can't imagine it was intentional, but it's damn annoying. Overall, the game is great. It's a fantastic swan song to the series. I know I was harsh on the game, but that's because I love the series. I'm far less pessimistic about Dark Souls 3 than I am 2. At least there's substance in this game, even if some of the changes get on my tits with each playthrough. Ultimately, I feel my love-hate relationship with this game will continue. But it probably won't stop me from returning to this now and again. I can wholeheartedly recommend this to people as their first Souls game, as there's not a whole lot of essential continuity. It's easily the most refined entry, and some of my criticisms are largely subjective. Once again, this is a game I love, but also a game I fucking despise. At any rate, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and that this video rekindled you. You thought I was going to say light a fire under you, didn't you? Fuck, I just said it. Anyway, have a great night, y'all. Next time we'll be looking at Shadow of the Colossus on PS4. After, no doubt, some other art video I haven't had the time to plan out.